Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Radovan Musil, and it's my honor to be a leader of the Redhead Development Center here in Brno. I would like to welcome you here at the Developer Conference, one of the largest open source conference globally. I have to say that looking at this event, I am amazed. I am amazed what we have achieved over the years from a small conference organized by a group of enthusiastic people. It has grown into a really global event. We have more than 1,000 visitors, many of them, maybe 250 from abroad. And it's like mirroring what we achieved with the development center here in Brno. Nobody expected 10 years ago that Redhead will have its largest development center here in Brno. So I would like to use this opportunity to thank to all those enthusiastic people that helped us to build this over the years. Specifically this time, I would like to thank all the volunteers, it's more than 100, that helped us to organize this event. I would like to thank to Jan Bleha, who is managing this event, and I would like to thank to the University of Technology, Faculty of Information Technologies, that is hosting this event and that's supporting us. Also, I would like to use this opportunity to invite you to another event. If you are interested in our technologies, we are organizing open house in 2 months. It's 6th of April, and everybody is welcome to come to our office and to meet people and to talk about our technologies. So I wish you great 3 days. Thanks for coming. And enjoy the talks about new technologies.
Thank you, Radovan. My name is Peter Palaga. I am a session chair in this room together with Jiří. If you have any organizational questions, feel free to ask. I have a few points to note at the beginning. Please keep the room clean. When you enter and leave the room, please do it as quiet as possible. Don't forget to vote for lightning talks that take place tomorrow. There should be a table somewhere at the entrance where you can put your votes for lightning talks there. Don't forget to evaluate the sessions either through the mobile application or through the usual web page. Be active with questions, either during the presentations, if the presenter allows, or after that, you can get some swag. And there's a party tomorrow. To get in, you need a ticket that you can get on the Redhead recruitment booth at the entrance here. And I welcome you to stay till the end of the conference on Saturday, because at the very end there will be a competition for cool prizes such as Arduinos, Raspberry Pis, and UBKs. The first speaker today is Jan Wildeboer. His official position at Redhead is EMEA Evangelist, and the question is there anybody here who doesn't know what kind of tattoo Jan has on his arm? Okay. Jan?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and welcome for showing up. I arrived yesterday, so first of all, I need to apologize. I'm a Redhead guy since 10 years, and this is my first visit to Brno. It's a shame, and I'm really deeply ashamed about that. And that's mainly because I'm Redhead's evangelist, and that means I'm like a supermodel. I don't go everywhere, I only go where I find comfort. And now, since 16th of November, there is a direct flight connection between Munich and Brno. I don't have to take the bus for 7 hours. I don't have to take the train. I can just jump in a plane, and 45 minutes later, I'm here. Which I, of course, used yesterday to visit this wonderful city, and I have discovered some very interesting bars. And I must admit, I will be back a few more times very soon to survive this. Now, why am I here? I was invited a few months ago, and people said, you need to come to Brno. And as always, I said, yes, I will come, and then typically I don't. But this time I said, it's going to be important. One of the reasons is that I'm 10 years at Redhead. When I started at Redhead 10 years ago, we were a company of 700 people worldwide. We were making 100-something million in revenue. I just looked up the numbers yesterday. We are now a company of 8,000 people doing $2 billion in revenue, selling free software. And that's the coolest thing on the planet. We have changed a lot. The company has changed significantly. When we started, we were all crazy people believing in open source, every morning waking up, looking in the mirror, singing the free software song, and having a big poster of Richard Stallman over our bed. I still have a big poster of Richard Stallman over my bed. I still know how to sing the free software song, and we will not sing it today, but we will. The thing is, and that's the topic of my talk, something or a few very big things have happened and nobody has really noticed. This world, as we know it right now, completely runs on free software. We are ruling the world as open source developers. And I'm not kidding. It's just some numbers to think about. There is not a single stock exchange on this planet that does not run on Linux. Not a single one. And that was definitely different 5 to 10 years ago. The question then becomes, because I'm supposed to talk about community, the question then becomes, are we ready for this? Do we understand as open source developers, as people interested in furthering free software wherever we can, do we really understand the responsibility we're taking on? Do we understand the power that we have? Are we ready to run the world with open source? I think we are. Open source has become default for a lot of reasons. And the main reason is it's a very logical and natural thing to do. When I started at Red Hat, I was a pre-sales guy. I was going to customers talking about open source, and I had to explain open source. I had to go to customers. I very well remember one of my first customer meetings in Switzerland with a very big bank. And this very big bank, the CIO had invited me to show them Red Hat Enterprise Linux and Red Hat Network and Satellite and all that system management stuff. So I did a presentation there of 6.5 hours, showing everything. You know, how do you kickstart a machine? How do you set it up? And at the end of these 6.5 hours, this CIO looked at me, and in his wonderful Swiss accent, he said, Mr. Wildeboer, that was a very interesting demonstration you gave us. But it is open source. And I was like, yeah, it's open source, of course. Well, we have talked to our lawyers, and our lawyers have told us that open source is a communist, socialist thing. And the moment we install a Linux machine in our data center, we have to make all of our systems open source, and we don't want that, so please go away and we will never use Red Hat. So I was like, okay, interesting. We didn't make the deal. I went back. I was really disappointed. I went to that same customer 2008 in the middle of the financial crisis where all the banks were struggling. And I came in there again, and they were slowly but surely, it's a Swiss bank, you know, they need time. They're not the fastest. So they were slowly but surely noticing that Sun Solaris might not be the future for them. So they wanted again to talk about Red Hat. So I did. and I showed all the cool stuff we had. And the CIO, a new CIO, and I said to him, you know, this is the fun thing. Your former CIO, which I talked to a few years ago, told me that I'm a communist and I'm a socialist, that we don't respect property, that we share everything because, you know, we are crazy people. Now here's the kicker. Your capitalist world now runs on communist-free software. Without open source, capitalism wouldn't even exist anymore. The financial crisis was only possible because Linux was able to handle all these transactions. Without the Linux kernel, there would have been no financial crisis. Think about that for a second. So this guy, he still didn't want to buy Red Hat. That happened 2009 when his bank was bought by an American bank. And the Americans came in and said, we're going to do everything with Red Hat. So, you know, this is how we do it. But the thing is, when I talked about open source years ago, I was talking to customers who were looking for cheap solutions, where open source was good enough. Open source was a good enough solution to replace proprietary stuff. You could use Linux in place of Windows. You could do all these kind of things. That has changed. Nowadays, and this is really a big thing, open source has always been a good enough alternative for closed source stuff. People were looking at open source to save money. People were looking at open source because people were like, yeah, well, you know, this open source stuff also works. It doesn't have all the features that we get with VMware or with other things, but it's good enough. Now, since round about 4 to 5 years, I think, open source has taken the lead in innovation. All the new big things that happen in IT all across the planet are now coming from open source. All the big things. If you talk about cloud computing, if you talk about DevOps, if you talk about big data, it's now from open source. And that means a lot. Open source methods are now the thing that we talk about. When I go to customers, they're not interested in open source anymore. They don't care what the new Red Hat product is or what the new JBoss stuff can do. Of course, they're technically interested, but practically they know already what's happening. It's open source. What they are now interested in is how can we use open source methods in our own organization? How can we build internal communities, and these internal communities use open source methods to do stuff? And this is where stuff gets really interesting. Nowadays, when I say at the beginning that we are ruling the world, I mean there's not a single person doing that. We are not a political movement driven by whatever crazy guy. We don't have a Donald Trump in open source. Well, thank God for that. But what we do have is thousands, literally thousands and millions of people all across the planet that care about this stuff. Why? Because we're driven by the same motivation. And this motivation thing is what companies are now very interested in. Just to give you some numbers to think about. There is a company in the US called Black Duck. Black Duck does an open source survey since more than 10 years where they ask some very specific questions. I have some numbers mixed here from 2014 and 2015. And this is maybe one of the most interesting ones. Open source is now chosen by organizations based on quality of code. And that has never been the case. It was always the number 5, number 6, number 7 reason. Now it's the first reason to choose open source. Code quality now happens in open source and nowhere else. People mainly develop using open source. Think about this. In the current survey from Black Duck, they had, I think, around about 2,500 companies that replied. Of these 2,500 companies, 3% said, we are not sure if we use open source. 5 years ago, that was 40% of the companies saying we are not using open source, or at least we don't know it. What has happened is that all the companies, everybody is using open source, no matter if they know about it or not. Everybody's using it everywhere. But in the past, it was a dirty secret in organizations. It was, let's set up a Linux server because going through the hassle of procuring a new Windows license is a lot of work. We don't want that. Now the mentality has completely changed. 70%, this is a number that is so fantastic, 70% of in-house developers at companies are now working with and on open source projects. 70%. There is effectively no one out there anymore that develops in a pure proprietary way. Nowadays, companies like Microsoft are coming here to these universities telling you that effectively they invented open source. They are now, everybody is now open source. Microsoft is as you know, a Redhead partner. Yes, it caused some disturbance in the force, I will admit. But I've talked to the Microsoft people and top-level people from Microsoft, and they fundamentally are happy to finally be able to talk about open source. They felt really bad inside their organization to not to be able to talk about open source the way they see it, that it's the best thing on this planet. So now that we are partners of Microsoft, and I'm invited to speak at Microsoft conferences. All the fun of it, you know, I love it. So I live in Munich, and Munich as a city has switched to Linux years ago, and everything is running on Linux. And Microsoft has moved their EMEA headquarters into the city of Munich. And that was based on the promise that another political party would win the elections in Munich, and they would revert the decision to use Linux and go back to Windows. Well, the other party won. So now Microsoft headquarters pays a shitload of taxes to the city of Munich so that we can do more open source than Linux. I like Microsoft, they're good guys, you know, don't get me wrong. And when nowadays 61% of the companies are expected to contribute and adopt open source, this means a fundamental change, a fundamental shift. When companies are willing to let their in-house developers work on open source projects, create code, and give that to the upstream communities, work with them together, then we know we are in a different world. And the cool thing about this new world that we are now living in is, I've been thinking about this for a long time. You know, of course, I'm technically in Red Hat, I'm in sales. I need to sell subscriptions. When we don't sell subscriptions, we cannot pay our people. It's really simple. So how do you convince customers to pay Red Hat for free software? Now, the one thing that is now coming very clear is companies everywhere in a vertical. Take one vertical. Let's talk about, let's say, telecommunication companies. So, you know, the Vodafones, AT&T, Verizon, and Telefonica, and whatever they're called, Deutsche Telekom. They are effectively all doing the same. Yeah, they have mobile networks, and you have to transfer the calls and the data through this, and etc. They buy from the same companies. These big mobile networks are coming from companies like Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei, and etc. And they were noticing something. So I noticed this a few years ago. When you have a mobile phone in Germany, you are typically either at T-Mobile or at Vodafone or O2 or whatever. And when you switch providers for whatever reasons, it's quite an act. You have to sign a lot of papers, and it takes days for it to work, and it's not really sure if your number keeps on working and all that kind of stuff. And I talked to these CIOs from these companies, and I was like, I don't get it. I mean, you're Deutsche Telekom and you're Vodafone, and you're using the infrastructure that has been sold to you by Ericsson. So effectively, you're using the same stuff. Why isn't it interoperable? Why doesn't it talk to each other? And then I found out this is the way Ericsson makes billions of money. Interoperability for them is not in focus, because if it's interoperable, then the customer is happy, but they don't make money. So they try everything to not do that. So what did the telcos do? They did something that I find extremely interesting. They found out that they're all using the same stuff anyway, so why not develop it ourselves? They came together. They have a global group called ETSI, and ETSI is the European Télécommunication, whatever French thing. And in ETSI, you have all these top-level architects. And they were sitting there and saying, okay, what we see is very simple. The infrastructure that we need to run a telco is 90% nothing special. We can all run it as virtual machines on commodity hardware. We don't need this specific, very expensive hardware from companies like Ericsson and Huawei. So let's define an architecture together. And you can look it up. It's really interesting. It's called NFV, Network Function Virtualization. And then they called me 2 years ago, and they said, Mr. Wildeboer, we think open source could be important for this. I was like, okay. So I went to a conference, and I explained to them how to do NFV, this complete infrastructure for all telcos worldwide, how to do that open source. I took the architecture picture from NFV, I looked through open source projects, and I matched them, and I said, okay, this is how you do it. And I got yelled at. Ericsson, the guy from Ericsson yelled at me. He said, you are building an illegal cartel. You are building a new monopoly. And I'm like, welcome to the reality. I mean, sorry, but I'm not. I'm creating an open source reference implementation for this infrastructure. It's open source. Everybody can use it. You as Ericsson, you can take it and build a product based on that. And then you can still make a lot of money. I have just saved you 90% of your time to market. I've saved you 80% of your development cost. And you are complaining that I'm doing it wrong? Wow, that's interesting. Net result, nowadays we have a project called OPNFV, so the open source version of NFV, which is supported by all the big telcos on the planet. Because, and that's the point of my story, what companies are seeing is that if you take an IT stack in an organization, 80% of the components in that IT stack are virtually identical across your vertical. Everybody uses the same shit. That's reality. And the moment you see that 80% is effectively the same stuff, you know that everything in that 80% is not relevant for your competitiveness. It's not going to bring you extra money. Effectively, it's the opposite. It's a cost thing. Now, if you know that it's a cost thing and it's 80% and it's virtually identical, and you combine that with open source, boom. Then you get a complete vertical to cooperate on that 80%. I get 5 big companies. For example, I take 5 banks. 5 banks working on that 80%. The investment risk for them has suddenly gone down 80%. Now they only have 20% risk, but they have to work together. But because it is a non-competitive part of their stack, they can focus on the 20% on top. That's where the cool stuff happens. That's where you are agile. That's where you can use all the fancy buzzwords nowadays about DevOps development and whatever. What's agile? What's the new buzzword right now? I don't even know. Marcus, you know the fancy buzzwords. What's right now? DevOps? What's after DevOps? Microservice. Oh, microservices. Of course. How could I forget? Microservices. So cool. But microservices only work when you have a sustainable, very stable infrastructure underneath. And that's the 80% thing. Now, that's exactly what Red Hat does. We are an 80% company that can also help with the top 20%. But these companies are now seeing that sharing this knowledge is a non-competitive thing. When I went to conferences 10 years ago, people were not talking about stuff. People were very secretish because everything was a corporate secret. Nowadays, they talk, they discuss, they share their problems because they know it's in a part of the stack that they can share. And that's why open source is ruling the world. That's why we are running that 80% in almost every vertical. I now talk to architects that say, Mr. Wildeboer, can you help us define a stack where there are 2 things for sure? No Oracle and no Microsoft. Did I tell you I love my job? It's wonderful to have these kind of things. IBM? So IBM, yes. Let me put it this way. Red Hat has celebrated 50 quarters of double-digit revenue growth in a row. 50 quarters. IBM has not celebrated the fact that they have been losing revenue for 15 quarters in a row. That's all I'm saying about IBM. We can have a discussion about that later after I had a few beer and I can officially say that I don't know what I'm talking about. But the world is moving. We are moving away from a product solution-driven world where you go to a company to buy a product into a layered world where you have a storage layer, a compute layer, a connect layer, and you do that stuff. And that's what open source is relevant about. And this is creeping into a lot of organizations. Companies that say we are willing to support open source, so the 61% that I showed in the previous slide, when you ask them, why are you doing this? They say it's the only way to attract good developers. Now think about that for a second. all the young developers that are coming into organizations right now, they use GitHub, they use Stack Overflow, and they will not do anything else. You cannot lock them up in a room and say you are going to develop Microsoft whatever proprietary shit for the next 20 years, and you're not allowed to talk to anyone about this. I learned this the hard way. Everybody knows Samba, I guess, Samba for file sharing and etc., which is based on the SMB protocol that Microsoft used. I found out recently, now that we are partners and we're talking to Microsoft, you know how many people developed SMB and maintained it over 20 years at Microsoft? How big the team is that did this? 6 people. 6 people caused all that trouble. Wrote this wonderful software. So the young generation, you people here, when you go into companies to work and do stuff, you want these methods, these possibilities, and you don't even think about it. Of course you go to Stack Overflow to get questions answered. Even thinking of introducing a Stack Overflow license where I say, my software is completely clicked with code snippets from Stack Overflow. But this change that we developers have is now creeping up in the management layers. Now we see big organizations understanding that open source is the most important thing for them. And we're moving into a world of open organizations. And I want to keep it that way. I really want to. And I think we, as an open source community, should become aware of this. We should understand that whatever decision we make is having a real big impact. No matter how small your open source project is, somebody is using it out there. And you might run into places where it gets used where you wouldn't expect it. One of these things is, for example, an organization that you all know, which is a big customer of Red Hat. It's called the NSA. And the NSA is a very nice group of very sophisticated, knowledgeable people. And they gave us stuff like SA Linux. It was so much fun when the NSA came to Red Hat and said, we want to make Linux more secure or else we cannot use it. You have to support it. And we said, we cannot do it. And they said, yeah, well, we changed the kernel. You look at all the cool stuff we did. Here, it's all in there. You need to support it. No, we cannot. And then we said, so the NSA said, what are we going to do with that? And we said, well, we can support it if it's upstream. So the NSA said, okay, then we'll make SA Linux upstream. Can you help us with that? Of course we can help with that, which we did. And then 3 years later, the NSA comes back and says, they didn't talk directly to me, but they talked to our legal guys, and they were like, now there's a problem. So SA Linux is now upstream in the kernel, yes. And every Linux out there is having the hooks and the stuff to use SA Linux, yes. And SA Linux is GPL licensed, yes. GPL means everybody can use it, yes. So that means North Korea can use SA Linux, yes. Iran, at that time, Iran was the biggest enemy. There's this Orwellian thing now. Iran is our big friend, but a year ago they were the big enemy. And Iran can use as yes. Oh, that's a violation of export restrictions that we have as a US government agency. And I was innerly smiling, like the NSA caring about laws. That's something new. But then they said, okay, so can we now take it away again? Can we remove SA Linux from the Linux kernel? And our reply was no. And this is what the NSA learned the hard way, but a lot of corporations out there are embracing. You can put your stuff that you think into the hands of the community. The community will take care of it. But you, as developers, you must be aware of the responsibility you're taking. When there are a few things that I really struggle with in open source, then the number one thing is ego. People being too arrogant and too proud and etc. I think open source should be about communication, community, and working together. When I see, yesterday we had a long discussion over a lot of beer on packaging systems. How do you package software? Why do we have, on a standard Linux operating system, so many different systems of packaging? And every new application layer that comes in brings its own packaging. Now everybody is making NPMs for Node.js, we have jar files, we have RPMs, we have dep files, we have all that kind of shit. We need to think about it. We need to be better at cooperation in the open source world. We need to talk with each other and not against each other. And just because you don't like a specific developer doesn't mean you have to re-implement his code all over again. When we are truly ruling the world as we do, we must make sure it works in the best possible way. And that's what I hope we can reach in the future, because IT is extremely simple. IT is nothing complicated. This is IT. This is everything. This is all you need to know about IT. In the past, we had companies and products. We had feature sets. We had lots of money for licenses. Now, CIOs see that effectively you need 3 things for your IT. And the number 1 thing is compute. You need some way to get the most out of your CPU power that you have. And this is what we have solved with open source. This is why everybody's using Linux. Very simple. 97% of all the top 500 supercomputers on this planet run Linux. So this is okay. We're good at this. The second thing is where stuff gets interesting, connecting. And when you connect stuff, it becomes complicated, because right now we have a lot of network connections, but when you have virtual machines, and these virtual machines are connecting via emulated networks, and effectively you have inter-process communication. So how do we get the most out of this connecting stuff? And the third thing is data. And data is where the big change is happening. In the past, data was very simple. You had memory, you had hard drives, and that's it. Nowadays, we have the internet, we have cloud computing, we have shared resources, we have high latency data sources, low latency data sources, and architectures are changing. Think about this for a second. I talked to an Intel engineer last year, and I said, I don't get it. How many of you people have an SSD drive in their laptop? Yeah? Thank you. An SSD drive is a very weird thing. An SSD drive is a collection of memory chips. And this collection of memory chips, we talk to it as if it is a spinning drive from 30 years ago. Yeah, the interface we use to connect an SSD is still the same old, typically SATA interface that was designed a long, long time ago. But it doesn't make sense. They're memory chips. Why not treat them as memory? Why not directly hook them up and get rid of all this emulation shit and etc.? Now, Intel told me that's exactly what they're going to do in the next generation. But are our operating systems ready for that? Right now, we still treat our operating systems in this very old Unix way of having a hard drive, having memory, having storage, and all that kind of stuff. Are we ready to change that? This means cooperation. Data means cooperating on all these levels. Suddenly, the people that care about memory fiddling are becoming highly relevant for data management. And suddenly, the people that spent years and years on optimizing spinning drives now have to work with SSD and have to relearn everything. And data is where the most interesting stuff happens. So when you're here at DEF CONF and you see people from the Ceph project and other stuff, talk to them. This is becoming really relevant. We're moving into a new world of data connection. Now, all of this together, the technical stuff that we have, the social stuff that we need to care about, I can tell you, I'm always an optimist. We will continue to win everything everywhere. Companies like Microsoft and etc., they will become open source companies just the way Redhead already is. And 5 minutes, damn it. So I cannot tell you all I wanted to say. But software-defined X, whatever you think about in the compute world right now, it will be software-defined. If it's software-defined networking, software-defined storage, etc. When stuff becomes software-defined, it will become open source. It will be based on open source solutions. So we need to make sure that we are in there in the best possible way. And if you are if you're working for a company that doesn't work with open source right now, when you're part of the 3% of the companies of the world that don't care about open source, that's fine. You're going to get rich. It's going to be good. But you're not going to enjoy it. If you really want to have the fun, that's why we're here, because only with open source this is possible. And open standards, I could talk for another 2 hours about open standards. I don't want to. I think here at DEF CONF and last week at FOSDEM, the people that do open source, they have grown up. When I look back over my 10 years that I went to FOSDEM, I went to the very first FOSDEM in 2000. I even had a panel there because I called the organizer and I said, there's a question I would like to ask. And some people, okay, you have a room, organize. And this mentality that we have in open source, please, all of you, keep it alive. Work hard for it. We didn't get this for free. We at Red Hat and people at Debian and people at SUSE, we worked really hard to make all of this work and to give all of you opportunity and to turn the world into an open source world. This fight is not over. Don't relax. Don't say it's done. Please continue to do the hard work. And if you ever need any help in that or motivation, I am a Red Hat sales guy, which means I have a Red Hat corporate credit card, which means I can buy you a beer and pay for it. And with that, thank you for listening. And if you have questions, you will find me. Thanks. I take questions, yes?
We need your presentation.
But I guess we have to switch rooms, so questions outside is the fastest.